Hello, I'm Nigel Kobold, and this is the Lord of Lightning. That thumbnail might have looked a little bit clickbaity, but let me tell you, this does absolutely crazy amounts of damage. It has legitimately trivialized a decent handful of bosses to the point where it's like, it might be too strong, actually. Anyway, we are primarily a Faith caster, focusing on dragon cult spells and using abilities and items to buff that damage, though we do have a melee weapon that we can bust out for enemies when they don't need the oomph from spells or if they surprise us in melee. And lastly, we have technically 2 armor sets, I guess. One that leaves us very light in a dragon form that gives us access to a 20% dragon cult incantation buff, and the other that will give us 51 poise and an 8% dragon cult damage buff that is permanent rather than on a use. As usual, I'll have wiki links for any items or abilities that I mention in the description. This build is really a ton of fun out in the world and laughably fun on bosses, so let's get into it. For our weapons, let's start with our seals. We will either be using 2 Gravelstone seals, or if you haven't been to New Game Plus yet, the Erdtree seal and a Gravelstone seal in the offhand. 2 Gravels do seem to pull ahead a little bit in lightning damage, but we do have a couple non-lightning spells in here, so there's an argument to sticking to the Erdtree as well, and that's what you'll see me doing in the video. Next up is the Flowerstone Gavel. Fair warning, the weapon art on this is going to be doing more damage for me in this video than it would for the 150 version of this build. I've got 80 arcane, but that's going to be the only thing the arcane is really affecting, so just a heads up. That said, we are not here for the damage it does anyway. The weapon art, Flower Dragon Bolt, debuffs a target's lightning resistance by 23 to 30%, depending on if you fully charge the ability or not. Now, this only lasts for 20 seconds, so you're really going to want to use it and then go into a heavy hitting spell, but there's going to be a lot of boss fights that only last about 20 seconds because of the insane damage that you are going to be doing. Next up is our Out in the World weapon. You can feel free to swap this for something else if you'd like, but I've taken the Vulgar Malicious Saw. You can infuse this to either Sacred or Flame Art to make the most of our High Faith, and I use the Stormcaller Ash of War. The weapon is fairly light, but has decent range, and a bleed proc if it happens to hit enough times. But I really mostly just use this for the Stormcaller Ash of War rather than the basic attacks, and it's mostly for kind of a combo of crowd control and damage. If an enemy surprises you in melee, you can start swinging, and odds are they will jump or attack into it, be flinched repeatedly, and then knocked down by the last swing. It just allows a lot of safety out in the world, as a lot of the lightning spells function best when fully charged and can often be a little bit tough to chain cast, particularly in melee. Moving on to armor, our first option is that you have no armor and you use the Priestess Heart to turn your human flesh into that of an ancient dragon. This will give you 7% damage negation and 70 resistances, which is to say you will be pretty squishy. Using this item again after transforming will give you a 20% bonus to Dragon Cult incantations for 60 seconds, which has no cost but does have a moderate animation, so be prepared for that. Our other option is using a combination of the Death Knight armor and the Rakshasa armor. If you go ahead and use the Death Knight Helm and Chest Piece, which give a 4% buff to Dragon Cult incantations, alongside the Rakshasa Legs and Gauntlets, which give a flat 4% damage buff to all damage, it gives us exactly 51 poise and still gives you that 8% increased damage on your Dragon Cult incantations. If you're more concerned with fashion, you can obviously just rock the full Death Knight set, and you could swap in the Bullgoat's Talisman if you really wanted full Death Knight and to have your poise above 51. Speaking of talismans, we are going to be running the Phlox Canvas Talisman for 8% increased incantation damage, Godfrey Icon for 15% increased damage on charged spells, which most Dragon Cult spells are, Ratting on icon to boost our virtual dexterity by 30, increasing our cast speed to make sure we can get those full charges off more easily. And lastly, the Lightning Scorpion Charm for a 12% increase to lightning damage at the cost of 10% more physical damage taken. If you want more defenses, such as a Dragon Crest Great Shield, or maybe utility out in the world like Blessed Blue Dew for some FP regeneration, I generally take the Lightning Scorpion off just because, well, that does add a lot of damage. It also comes with the debuff. You can pick your preference. For our stats at level 150, we will be going with 50 Vigor, 30 Mind, 22 Endurance, 15 Strength, 13 Dexterity, minimum Intelligence, which is 9 for me, 75 Faith, and 15 Arcane. The Strength and Dexterity are for the Vulgar Militia Saw, and the 15 Arcane will be for the Flowerstone Gavel. Depending on your starting class, you might have to adjust those stats a little, and I would recommend either lowering your Mind or your Faith, because those aren't going to have that big of an impact on, locking you out of gear or messing up your equip load. If you're going to go above this point, I would definitely take your Faith to 80, Vigor to 60, probably add a bit more Endurance, but at that point you're really getting into pick your favorite what you want. Moving over to Consumables, the one I've already mentioned is that you might be using the Priestess Heart to both transform into a dragon and then get that 20% bonus to Dragon Cult incantations for 1 minute. Outside of that, the only consumable I found I really use occasionally on this is still the classic Boiled Crab. 20% physical damage negation for a minute can be really good. In our Physic, we will be using the Lightning Shrouding Crack tier for 20% increased lightning damage, and the Bloodsucking Crack tier for an additional 20% increase to all damage. It does give you a damage over time effect, but we can offset this slightly with a regeneration incantation later. As for Great Rune, I would say Radon's is the way to go. A 15% increase to your HP, stamina, and FP is something that we can make good use of. Alright, let's get into our spells. I'll knock out the buff spells quickly. We're going to be using Blessing of the Erdtree for 12 HP per second for 90 seconds. This helps offset the health loss from the Bloodsucking Crack tier pretty nicely. Golden Vow for 15% increased damage and 10% damage negation for 80 seconds. I would then use either Howl of Shibriri for another 25% increased damage, alongside then a 30% increase to damage taken for 40 seconds. Or, on the more defensive side, one of the Greater Barrier incantations to combat an elemental type. For example, you could use Barrier of Gold, and that gives you 60% magic damage negation for 70 seconds, which is pretty substantial. For our damage spells, our big single target nuke and stance breaker is Knight's Lightning Spear. This spell shoots out numerous lightning bolts, both kind of with one as a first hit and then a volley afterwards. Both of these tend to flinch enemies, so provided you've got decent range, this is actually not a bad spell to chain cast on tougher enemies, and it's definitely one of our main tools on bosses. Next up is the standard Lightning Spear. I find I use this against regular enemies out in the world where a fully charged hit will probably kill them in one shot, or if I need to throw out a spell quickly. The uncharged version of this spell actually comes out very fast. I also take Frozen Lightning Spear for applying Frostbite to deal 7% plus 30 HP of a boss's max HP, and increases their damage taken by 20% for 30 seconds. Against large bosses, this can hit multiple times to build up pretty quickly, or you can use it out in the world for tackling small groups of enemies if you get them kind of grouped up in front of you. Next up is, I would go as far to say, a literal nuke of a spell, Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike. So that conjures a large number of bolts in an area around us. The longer we charge it, which we should be trying to do, the more come out. So you get in right close against a large boss where this can hit multiple times, and it will absolutely decimate them. I then also take Pest Thread Spears. These can trivialize enemies like the Furnace Golems and other large bosses like the Elden Beast. And if you're having a hard time getting in close for Lightning Strike and getting the time to get the full charge off while close to them, this is a good alternative, and it gives us a standard physical damage option too. Lastly, I like to take a Dragon Breath spell, generally Rotten Breath. This can be your pick though. Nice for dealing with larger crowds of enemies, and I always like having access to Scarlet Rot. And we have the Arcane, so why not? And that's the build. It's definitely fun, and it is definitely powerful. I genuinely wonder if I'm ever going to do as much damage as this build in a single spellcast again. Probably not. If you enjoyed the video, it would be rad if you left it a like, maybe even a comment. Let me know if there's a certain build or vibe you'd like to see me take a crack at in the future, even something from another game. If you want to see more from me, subscribing probably won't be your deepest held regret in life, and I'd be pretty stoked about it. Regardless, thanks for watching. Good luck.